Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Marissa Khurma, and I am the program director of the Middle East program here at Wilson. We're truly delighted to be hosting this discussion of the new book by Amy Austin Holmes, who is a dear colleague and an alum of the Wilson Center. You've spent many years here at the Wilson Center working on this book. So, Stateless of Survivors, The Making of a Semi-Autonomous Region in Northeast Syria is truly a fascinating story of a region that has beat all odds in the midst of a country that was completely torn apart by civil war. And of course, different regional and global actors being part of that mix as well. And you truly delved into this this story, talking to people. I think you've been more than a handful of times to the region to truly understand how the different factions or people of different backgrounds came together to rebuild, to establish systems of governance that seem to be working really well. And then I think a very important point, which I know we will discuss later and you will probably present, is the role of women in all of this. I would also like to welcome Professor Ariel Ahram, who is also a Wilson alum and an author of many books. The most recent one is about conflict in the Middle East, so I'm sure we will also be hosting you back again for another discussion. But we look forward to today's discussion and to all of your questions. So Amy, I'll just kick it off with the very simple question of how did this project come about? Why did this specific region pique your interest for you to make it a long-term project and a book?
Well, thank you very much to the Wilson Center, the Middle East program, to Marissa, Alex, and your colleagues here who've made this event possible. I'm truly very indebted to the Wilson Center for giving me the opportunity to work on this project while I was here. I encountered a number of obstacles during the course of this research, as you may imagine, and I sometimes thought I would never finish it. And so I'm truly very grateful to the Wilson Center for providing me time and space to think and work about this and work on this project. And I'm also grateful to Ariel for serving as discussant. And thank you to all of you who are here in the room, and welcome also to the many people who've dialed in online. I look forward to answering your questions. So I started this project because I really wanted to understand who were the people who were fighting the Islamic State. I started this back in January of 2015, so almost 10 years ago now. And over the course of the years that I worked on this, I just became convinced that we really need to make the voices of those people heard who went on to defeat the Islamic State as a territorial caliphate, who have defied the Assad regime for now over a decade, and who've also created a form of local governance that is more inclusive than any other form of governance in Syria, which is now divided into 4 different zones of control. At the time, there were a lot of analyses about the Islamic State. Many think tanks here in town were focusing on who were these jihadists, where did they come from? But there was strangely not much focus actually on the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. And I thought that was odd. So I just genuinely wanted to understand who they were and to sort of go beyond the somewhat sensationalized, reporting sometimes of the women that were fighting against ISIS. And there was very little attention, oddly, on the civilian women that also played a very important part in this conflict and in the creation of a semi-autonomous region. And so the more I got to know the people who I interviewed, and who over 400 members, rank and file members of the SDF, took my survey, men and women, the more I got to know them, the more I realized that our understanding of them was actually quite superficial, and that there was a lot of disinformation being put out about them, and that we weren't really countering it very well. And so I hope that my book will contribute to a better understanding, a more nuanced understanding of this region, and that it will help us also ideally, reprioritize Syria, because it's fallen a little bit off the headlines. I do, however, believe this is actually an important moment to refocus our energies on Syria, and that we could make progress if we put our minds to it. So.
Thank you. I know you have a presentation for us to just walk us through the main elements of the book and the main themes. So go ahead, and then Ariel will go over to you after. Go ahead.
Sure. So what I find when I began working on this project, that many people, I think, don't fully understand the history going back to how it was even before the United States got involved and officially began supporting the Syrian Democratic Forces in 2015, that already in 2013, Kurds in the YPG, YPJ, Syrian and Syriacs in the Syriac Military Council, and Arabs in the Sanadid forces had already began to cooperate as they were faced with an onslaught of extremists. And within a few years, these women and men who initially didn't even have uniforms, they evolved into a multi-ethnic, multi-religious force in which the diverse people of the region are represented. So you have Arabs from every tribe in the Northeast, Assyrians, Armenians, Yazidis, Circassians, Syrian Turkmen, and Kurds who fought side by side to defend their land and defeat the caliphate. One grueling battle at a time, the SDF expanded far beyond the Kurdish heartland known as Rojava into Arab-majority population centers. And by the time the Islamic State was vanquished in March of 2019, over 11,000 young SDF fighters lay buried in cemeteries. As the anti-Assad protests in Damascus and elsewhere spiraled into a brutal civil war, the Kurds in the north set up a rudimentary self-administration in 3 cantons, Afrin, Kobani, and Jazeera. They were surrounded by enemies. The cantons that declared self-rule were not even connected to each other, and their chances of survival were slim. Then the Islamic State took over chunks of Syria. While ISIS carried out beheadings on the main square of Raqqa, the Kurds audaciously promoted women into the most powerful positions of their autonomous administration. And these women were the vanguard of what has been referred to as the Rojava Revolution. So instead of demanding the fall of Assad's regime, they wanted autonomy from his regime. 8 years later, they controlled 1/3 of Syria and 2/3 of its resources. They then had to govern this region, and the name of the entity has changed names over the years. It's now known as the Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria, so I'll just refer to it as the Autonomous Administration for short. But really, their triumph over ISIS, as remarkable as it is really only half the story. And that other half of the story of the creation of a semi-autonomous governing structure in the wake of the defeat of the territorial caliphate is still relatively unknown, including, I think, here in Washington, D.C. And so, but I go back because I believe that a lot of the analyses that have come out over the years, they still are referring to this as a Kurdish region, a Kurdish movement. But really, it's much more complex than that, and truly multi-ethnic and multi-religious. And so that's why I have a chapter in my book, and I'm only going to very briefly highlight 3 of the chapters in my book because we want to have time for questions. But I argue that in order to really find the origins of this experiment in self-rule, we have to begin at the time of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the formation of the early Turkish Republic. This is a time when the Armenian genocide and other Ottoman-era pogroms occurred, when Kurds and Christians were faced with either annihilation or forced assimilation. And so in an attempt to secure their continued existence, Kurds and Armenian genocide survivors forged an official alliance, and they created a semi-autonomous region in Mount Ararat in eastern Anatolia on the borderlands of modern-day Turkey and Armenia. And so in chapter 2, I actually use previously unpublished archival documents from the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, the Dashnak Sutyun, as well as memoirs of some of the leaders of this rebellion. And this, the map So the official treaty of collaboration between Khoybun and Dashnak is still relatively, I think, understudied. But in my view, this is one of the most remarkable rebellions in this period. There were 20 officially recognized rebellions at this time, and I think the Mount Ararat rebellion is one of the most remarkable because it was based on this official treaty of collaboration between Kurds and Armenians. It was also supported by others. But I used some of these unpublished archival documents. They communicated in French. This is a letter by Suraya Bedr Khan, who is head of Khoybun's external relations, to the ARF office in Paris from 1931. There's also a photo here in the middle of Ardashat Muradian, known as Zilan Bey. So he was Armenian and the Kurdish commander-in-chief of the forces on Mount Ararat. And as you can see from this map, these are the deportation routes that were used in 1915 during the genocide. So many of these Armenians wound up in northern Syria because they were deported. So northeastern Syria begins where the deportation routes ended in 1915. And many of the people who I interviewed would describe themselves as the descendants of survivors, as the descendants of this genocide. So the ideology of these insurgents at the time on Mount Ararat was quite egalitarian in outlook. They officially proclaimed that everyone would be treated equally, regardless of their race or religion. And this far-reaching commitment to equality is also ensconced in the social contract of the autonomous administration, declared in 2014. And this stands in contrast to the founding ideologies of Kemalism or Baathism that promoted Turkification and Arabization vis-a-vis their respective minorities. This rebellion was eventually crushed in 1932, and some of the reporting at the time, both by British colonial officials and some of the American media that were reporting about it, talked about extermination, and that they feared that essentially the same type of violence that was used against Armenians was being used against Kurds at the time. And this rebellion is to a large extent been forgotten, but I wanted to write about this in my book because I see this as sort of this legacy of solidarity between Kurds, Armenians, and Assyrians, I think, has now blossomed again in northern Syria. And this solidarity, I think, is best expressed through the Syrian Democratic Forces, who, as I mentioned, I had over 400 of the rank-and-file members took my survey. I traced the history of how the YXG, as it was known at the time, eventually evolved into the YPG for men and the YPJ for women, which in turn evolved into the SDF. The questionnaire that I had was available in Arabic, Kurmanji, and Turkish. The SDF, as I mentioned, has incorporated virtually all of the Arabs from this region into the SDF. So these are the 46 different tribes and sub-tribes that my survey respondents belong to. I also found that a number of Muslim Armenians have joined the SDF. So Armenians who were either adopted by Arab or Kurdish families, or they were orphaned, and therefore they were brought up as Muslims, but they still continue to identify as Armenians. And so some of these Armenians, both Muslim Armenians and Christian Armenians, are in the Nubar Ozanian Brigade, which is now also in guarding the front lines around the region around Tal Temer. And one of the surprising findings when I started the survey in 2015, again, I sort of expected that Kurds in Syria would be demanding a form of an independent region similar to the Kurds in Iraq, and I was surprised that over time, my survey respondents kept saying, no, they do not want that. They want to actually remain part of Syria. They want to remain part of a decentralized region within the borders of Syria. And even as the SDF grew more powerful and grew larger and larger year by year, this commitment to remaining part of Syria stayed. I mean, and this is something that I think is still misunderstood, but by 96% of my respondents say they want to remain part of Syria. And then the last chapter that I'll just highlight here is the chapter on the women's revolution in Rojava. I have here on the slide a few of the provisions that were in the first social contract in 2014, and then the next social contract in 2017, where it's clear that they're trying to articulate and ensconce this gender equality between men and women in the social contract. So over time, this has evolved into a system that is quite distinct from that of the Assad regime. This is from a piece that I published with the Council on Foreign Relations. And then I know these are a lot of numbers on a slide, but I think it's important to show how region by region, so Jazeera, Euphrates, Deir ez-Zor, Raqqa, Afrin, Manbij, Tabqa, you can see the number of people who are working for the autonomous administration and the percentage of them that are women, and then also by institution. So this is not just some sort of token inclusion. It's not like they're just taking a few women and putting them, on a panel or in a committee or in the cabinet and then saying that's good enough for us. They genuinely are trying to include women in these institutions. It's an imperfect project, obviously, but I think that we, can't deny that it is a genuine commitment to inclusion. And finally, my survey data found that these ideas of gender equality are embraced by the rank and file. It's not just these elite sort of cadre or the elite sort of leaders of the movement that are, espousing gender equality, but according to my survey data, it's also the rank and file that are embracing this. And so I think I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. So many questions were popping up, especially on the role of women, but I'm going to turn it over to our discussant. So, Ariel, over to you.
Thank you so much. Amy, thanks so much for sharing this work that is very labor-intensive and dangerous and risky at some points. And I think it is ultimately a testament to the Wilson Center to have the vision and fortitude to want to generate this kind of work. So it's a great example of the kind of collaboration and support that scholarship requires. So congratulations to the center as well. In looking at this book, I think that to me, there were two different parts of my brain that were activated. There was a kind of my historical sociology brain, which was really interested in this account about the end of the Ottoman Empire, and then there was my interest in the contemporary politics. And so if you'll allow me, I'll have two different questions that focus on two different areas. The first is the legacies of the Mount Ararat rebellion. We're in 2024, the last 5 years I've spent hearing these kind of centennial memorializations of Sykes-Picot and the Treaty of Lausanne and the Treaty of Sèvres and all of the kind of these diplomatic accords that came at the end of World War I, and these reflections of were they important or not important, do they exist, are they still important, do they matter, do they not matter? Mount Ararat did not make the list, though, in most cases. And the question I want to ask for you is, how is this historical rebellion, how is it memorialized within the autonomous region? How has it been brought into the historical conscious, the imagined community, the imagined history that is being generated right now in northeastern Syria? So I think let me pose that as the first question, and then I'll come to the second question.
So thank you for again taking time to be here with us today. I know it's a busy time of the semester, especially for those of faculty members who are teaching, so I do appreciate it. I think that, again, when I started this project, I didn't intend to go back to this period in time of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the early Turkish Republic. It was really because my survey respondent and the people who I was interviewing kept referring to it themselves. And so I felt like I sort of had to go back and understand their own history because this was still so important for how they identified. And so that was, the first reason that I just felt like I wouldn't be doing these people justice if I didn't also, go back to this period in time. And the second, reason is because as I began to, the Sheikh Said rebellion, for example, or the Dersim revolt are actually more frequently referred to by the contemporary inhabitants of northern Syria. So the Ararat rebellion, I became sort of fascinated by this because I saw so many parallels to what happened at the time in the late 1920s and early 1930s and what was happening today. Because, it's easy to say, oh, this is a multi-ethnic, movement, to talk about diversity, to talk about inclusion. I mean, that's something you can sort of pay lip service to. But I wanted to know, how deep are those roots? How deep does that go? Where does that come from? Is this just something that happened, in 2012 or 2013 when there was this, when they were faced by Al-Qaeda and then the Islamic State? Is this just sort of a blip in the, historical record? And I found that it's actually not, that this history of solidarity between Kurds, Armenians, Assyrians goes back a century. And that it's remarkable, it's a remarkable story of how, when they were faced with the 1915 genocide and then attempts at forced assimilation towards Kurds, that this is how Kurds and Armenians, some Kurds and Armenians responded to this by deciding that they should form an official treaty of collaboration to defend this region of Eastern Anatolia that's now on the borders of Eastern Turkey and modern-day Armenia. And it's quite remarkable to me how little had been written and how, and I think, it's not a coincidence that because this was such a remarkable rebellion, perhaps more effort has been, perhaps government officials have put more effort into suppressing the memory of it. It could be because there are fewer available documents. The ARF archives in Watertown, Massachusetts, for anyone who's interested, I highly recommend making use of those documents because they are now available in the archives, although they haven't all been cataloged. But there is a trove of information that we could make use of. And so I would encourage anyone who is interested in this topic to do further research, because I think, I myself just scratched the surface of it, but I hope that I've inspired others to, continue looking into this forgotten period of Kurdish Armenian history.
Before you ask the second question, I just wanted to remind our audience online to also leave questions via our Twitter handle. And I'm going to give the moderating chair to my colleague, Alex Farley. I'm off to another panel, but Ariel, go ahead.
And I'm sorry for the second interruption. Quick note for the online audience, the chat feature is not working properly, so you can send a question to mep@wilsoncenter.org. You can send it via email, or you can tweet at Wilson Center MEP via Twitter. So thank you. Ariel?
Great,
go ahead.
Thanks. So we've started with a story about historical legacies. Now let's fast forward. I think you did a wonderful job talking about the three achievements of defeating ISIS, defying the Assad regime, and creating local governance that is inclusive and functional, and at this point we could say enduring as well. The model of this autonomous region is different from the model we see in other parts of Kurdistan, and we know that there's political tensions between the SDF, the PYD, and the KRG. It's also different from the models we see elsewhere in the region of other groups that are talking about federalism or devolution or other kinds of even secession. How sustainable is this model, and how exportable is it? And is it something that we should be, people who are concerned about political stability and coexistence in the region, is it something that we should be looking at more closely, or is it an aberration that we're not likely to see again?
So I think, there was a lot of skepticism back in, 2015, 16, that this model could be exported beyond the Kurdish majority regions of Afrin, Kobani, and then Jazeera, which is more diverse. But as we've seen over time, it has actually been exported to other parts of Syria as those territories were liberated from the Islamic State. They have at times faced resistance. I think that's most clear in Deir ez-Zor, in the province of Deir ez-Zor. However, there's other regions like Manbij, for example, where the model has actually worked quite well in an Arab majority city. Also, as I mentioned, the Sanadid forces that are based in the eastern part of the northeast on the border to Iraq, or the Kurdistan region of Iraq. For example, the Sanadid forces, who've been cooperating with the YPG since 2013, and do not allow women to join and fight in combat. And they're not being forced to do that, right? I mean, so they sort of coexist with these different approaches towards the role of women in combat, and allowing women to fight in combat was something that was also only very recently permitted here in the United States. So whereas, by contrast, the Manbij Military Council, for example, does have both women and men who are part of the combat forces. So I'm just giving these as examples of two other Arab regions where they have actually worked and embraced this model. Because Deir ez-Zor is often mentioned as an example of where there are tensions. However, as I'm sure many of the people in the audience here know, there are other reasons for these tensions in Deir ez-Zor relating to the presence of Iranian-backed militias, because the regime is also just right across the river on the other side. But in terms of, I've also, and one final example of how, again, something that surprised me over the course of my research is that a number of people who are from Idlib have formed actually sort of a government in exile in Raqqa, an Idlib social council that they would like to implement in Idlib if they had the chance to return to Idlib, because Idlib is currently controlled by Hayat al-Sham and other extremist groups. So a number of Arabs in the Liwa Shemal Demokrati, the Northern Democratic Brigade, that are from Idlib, who were expelled from Idlib. They went to Afrin, and then when Afrin was taken by Turkey in 2018, they were expelled again, or they fled again into the northeast. And so these are another example of Arabs from Idlib who would like to implement this model in Idlib if they have the chance to do so in the future. So, these are just some examples of how I think it is exportable to other parts of Syria, or at least some Syrians are saying they would like that. But I can't speak for, obviously, Syrians in regime-held parts of Syria or other parts of the country. So,
Great, thank you.
Do you have another question, Ariel, or should I take it over from the chair? Just by way of introduction, again, I'm Alex Farley. I'll just be continuing the conversation, and we'll be taking questions in about 10 minutes, so get ready with those. But Amy, I wanted to go back to the role of women in the Syrian Democratic Forces. So this is something I know is a main feature of your book. I also remember we published an interview that you did with one of the senior commanders. I think we published it on the Enhedawana blog a while ago. That was a few years ago now. But I just wanted to ask, kind of in general strokes, how is the approach to women different? How are they enshrining it in policy? And then how are you observing governance to really be different when you do have this actual observed effect where women are playing more role in leadership because they're being invited to do so? And as a particular note, is there a difference you see with the way they handle women after conflict? Because we know that conflict affects women and children in a particular way, in a heavier way than other combatants and veterans. So those 3 points, if you could zoom in on that.
Yes, one of the women the Arab women actually from Deir ez-Zor who joined the SDF already in 2016, if I'm not mistaken, Lilo Abdallah. So she joined the SDF while her province of Deir ez-Zor was still controlled by Daesh. So again, this is an incredibly brave decision at any time, but especially if you're from a region that is still under the control of ISIS. And she went on to then become the spokesperson and of the Deir ez-Zor YPJ in Deir ez-Zor. And so she became sort of a leader within the SDF as an Arab woman from Deir ez-Zor. And I, can share the link to that interview because I think she, could sort of very eloquently explain her reasons for joining more eloquently than I can. But she she also suffered because of this. I mean, she survived a number of assassination attempts. So this is, as I said, it's quite a risky decision, especially for an Arab woman from this region. But the fact that she stuck with the SDF for as long as she has, I think, is also testament to the fact that she must, believe in this project. Otherwise, why would she do this? So, just to go back to some of the slides, I know, again, this is a lot of text on a slide, but the social contract actually does attempt to ensconce these ideas of equality into this document that is used to govern the region. And what I think is also remarkable is that a lot of people were telling some of the women that were involved in developing the social contract, they were warned, these ideas are too radical, they won't be accepted, you need to, slow down or back off or, just be more patient. Eventually we'll get to this, once we defeat ISIS or once Assad is gone or something, then we can come back and deal with, women's or equality. But they didn't listen to that advice. They just continued to sort of press for, so between 2014 and 2017, the number of articles in the social contract that advocate for equality increased, right? I mean, so they didn't back off. They didn't say, okay, we're going to back down and sort of let other priorities, other issues take priority, but they continued to advocate for this, and which is also testament to their determination. This, I think, summarizes pretty well the differences between the autonomous administration in the Northeast and regime-held areas in terms of women's rights. And as we know from studies that have been done in well before the Syrian conflict began, research that had been done cross-nationally or comparatively on the role of women in conflict or post-conflict settings, some of this research has shown that if women are included at least to 30% of the parliaments are, if women are represented in the parliament by at least 30%, if I'm not mistaken, it was 30 or 35%. Again, these are cross-national studies, not just of Syria or the Middle East, but cross-national studies show that those cases of conflict when women are included in the parliament, the risk of conflict relapse drops significantly. And so the including women in parliament has been shown to be statistically significant in the sense that it has shown to prevent conflict relapse in many settings, in many other cultural settings, historical backgrounds, historical differences. And so it's not a silver bullet, but the fact that we know from other cross-national research that having women included in the government has been shown to prevent conflict relapse, I think is one reason why this project deserves to be supported and deserves to be improved. Also, it's not a perfect project by any means, but the fact that they are genuinely trying to include women, I think, is something that we should do more to support.
Right. And it's interesting to note the scientific basis that, and we've seen this multiple times, including women in governance presents, the opportunity for peace and prevent relapse into conflict, as you said. And, some of on this, if I point the audience to the slide, two of these things, or all of these are very difficult to do in societies where women do not have that level of participation, particularly enforcement and legislation around domestic violence, just as a tiny portion of that. So I just wondered if you can even anecdotally describe how governance is really different in this environment, being that they have had this, this experiment with women in leadership for several years now.
Right. So one thing that is different is that there are plans to hold local elections, municipal elections in the Northeast. They were originally scheduled for May 30, but they've now been postponed, I believe, till June 11 or July? June 11. So, they want to have elections that will be coming up very soon, which, I personally think it would be a good idea if there were international observers that would observe these elections, just like we have international observers in other countries that go through elections to make sure that they are free and fair. But just the fact that they want to have these elections, I think, is significant. And my sense is that, the United States doesn't want to sort of, you don't hear people officially calling for these elections and who are, U.S. government officials because they think it's sensitive or they think it's, could be seen as supporting this one region more than other regions of Syria. But again, I'm just going to make this sort of comparison, and I know that no comparison is perfect, so please forgive me, it's not a perfect comparison, but and when Germany was divided into East Germany and West Germany, we didn't tell West Germany, don't have elections because they don't have free and fair elections in East Germany when it was part of the, Soviet bloc, right? We didn't we didn't tell the West Germans it would be provocative to have elections because, the East Germans don't have free and fair elections. So, we supported free and fair elections in West Germany, even when free and fair elections were not taking place in East Germany. Again, this is not a perfect comparison, I realize that, but my point is that if you can have a system that becomes more democratic or is trying to have some, democratic elections that are meant to be, again, why are we not supporting this? I find it odd. We're the country that supposedly wants to promote a democracy, that wants to support elections, and we send election monitors to many other countries in the world. So I think it's just something to consider.
Yeah, and I think a good segue from that would be, and this will be my last question before opening it up to the audience, is I think the question that needs to be asked, which is the Washington policy question, is what to do about reintegration into Syria. As you stated, this is the policy of the autonomous region, and I know that they've been on the record with that for a long time. They've even met in Damascus with Syrian leaders. So if just an update on that, what is the status on that? What do we not know kind of generally in Washington, and what should policymakers be paying attention to in terms of progress on that?
So I think, I have one other slide in here where I, because this is an academic book. It's not a report that I wrote for policymakers. However, I think that there are a number of policies which we actually already support here in the United States, including Women, Peace, and Security, that was passed by, UNSCR Security Council Resolution 1325 already in the year 2000, so 24 years ago. We've committed this was passed, and the U.S. has developed also a National Action Plan for Women. We're committed to this. So if we are committed to promoting women, peace, and security, and if you look on the websites, for example, at the, I'm now the director of the Foreign Area Officers Program at George Washington, where we provide training to mid-career U.S. military officers. If you look at the website of, for example, U.S. Southern Command or U.S. Africa Command, you'll see on there women, peace, and security and how they're promoting women, peace, and security in Africa or in South America. And so, we're clearly committed to this, not just the State Department, also the Department of Defense. And so, you have here a situation where local people created this system that is trying to promote women. And so it seems like a no-brainer to me that we should also be trying to support them, because we do that in many other parts of the world, right? Secondly, there's the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that says people have the right to establish their own education systems, to have education in their own language. They've established a Kurdish curriculum, Aramaic curriculum, which I talk about in another chapter in my book, which I wasn't able to go into here. We have the Atrocity Prevention Act. We have a Civilian Harm Mitigation and Response Action Plan. And last but not least, there is the Syria General License 22, which allows investment in non-regime held parts of Northeast Syria and parts of Northwest Syria as well. And so that's an official policy that we allow investment in parts of Northeast Syria, Northwest Syria. I don't think we're doing enough to sort of promote this and to explain this policy, because we have a problem of over-compliance, that many countries are just afraid of being subjected to U.S. sanctions, so they over-comply and would be, are too afraid to actually, invest in Syria for fear of the sanctions that exist. But that's why I think we simply need to do more to sort of explain this policy of the general license and what is allowed and what is not allowed. But to your question about, and I'll just end on this so that we have time for questions, but until now, U.S. policy has been focused on the defeat ISIS mission, which is an ongoing mission in Northeast Syria. Although the territorial caliphate was defeated, there have been, prison breaks, for example, by ISIS militants, including very recently. And so the threat of ISIS is still very real, and it's, the fact that the SDF is burdened with sort of taking, responsibility for this huge population of ISIS detainees, including adults, but also children whose only crime was to have been born to parents who joined ISIS. The international community needs to do more to actually repatriate their citizens who joined ISIS. But I will just make one final point, which is that I am really concerned that the children of the ISIS detainees, who again are innocent, whose only crime was to have been born to parents who joined ISIS, they've grown up now in a situation, if they're in Al-Hol or Al-Roj, or before that they lived under ISIS, they've only been exposed to ISIS ideology. And so the children may actually be more radicalized than their parents. Because their parents, if they were born in, Tunisia or Kazakhstan or Europe, and they decided to join ISIS, they were at least exposed to other ideas before they decided to join ISIS, right? Whether they were, but the children aren't exposed to anything other than ISIS. So what do we think is going to happen to those children when they grow up? If they were 10 when Baghouz was liberated, now they're 15. If they were 15, now they're 20. And so, I think that we have to think very carefully about what we do now, because we are kind of at an inflection point, and it's not just a matter of defeating this horrific terrorist organization, but establishing an alternative to ISIS, an alternative to the Assad regime, and that's what they have tried to do in Northeast Syria. And that's what I think is necessary if we're going to have any chance of getting out of this cycle of conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are some very sobering realities, but we'll open it up to audience questions if there's any right off the bat. You, sir, please state your name and grab the nearest microphone on the table. And don't forget so the green light comes on. Yeah.
Dolavan Bawari from the KRG representation. I'm also a student of Dr. Aram. My question is, I'm still not clear to me, the form of government or what the Syrian Democratic Forces are trying to achieve in terms of autonomy or decentralization. What would the Kurdistan region of Iraq is classified as a federal region, and it's mandated by the Constitution. In negotiations, first of all, how would this be characterized? What form of decentralization or government would that be? And how would they share with power? If it's a region, how would they share power with other entities, other groups? The majority Arab in the south, Deir ez-Zor. And one final question, in terms of the classification, you had stated statelet, and so the classification for a non-state entity, Kurdistan region is also classified as a non-state entity or sub-state entity. What would Rojava or the Southeast Syria be classified as in terms Northeast? Yeah, I'm sorry, Northeast. Be classified as? Would it be a de facto state, a quasi-state, that was it. Thanks.
Yeah, those are great questions. So I use the term statelet in the title of my book because it is essentially, in part out of the necessity of defeating ISIS and then assuming control of that territory, they essentially had to establish some type of governance structures, which means that, and each chapter in my book goes through, for example, the chapter on the SDF, I also talk about the police forces, the Asayish or the Sutoro forces, the education system, the economy, the fact that they're trying to establish courts to try some of the ISIS detainees. So they've established a de facto governing system within Syria, right? so it's not a secessionist movement or a separatist movement, but they see themselves as having a unique form of government within Syria, perhaps similar to, I don't know, Quebec within Canada, for example. They previously had the term Democratic Federation of Northeast Syria, but they dropped that term federation from the title because they, again, wanted to be respectful of the sovereignty of Syria. And so this is, I think, a decentralized form of governance that they are trying to achieve within Syria, but until now they have not received the concessions that Iraqi Kurds had received from Baghdad in 2005. But we have members actually of the Northeast Syria, here who could answer your question probably better than I can, but they do not have, of course, that type of constitutional recognition that the Iraqi Kurdistan region does.
But what would it be classified as, what they're demanding or what they're seeking?
Decentralization. La Merkezia is what people often say to me in Arabic. They reject the centralized system of government that, has governed Syria now for, 50 years, half a century, both Bashar al-Assad and his father, Hafez al-Assad. And they want local people to govern this local region.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy, for that. You mentioned here many issues. About the women, equal genders in the Northeast Syria, as well as the ethnic and religious, diversity in this model of the Northeast Syria, the autonomous administration. This model, it is not against the principles of the Western countries, which is democracy, equal genders, diversity, all the religion and ethnic diversity. Why so far, till now, we couldn't find a clear policy from the Western countries or the US, let me say? Only their US policy was on defeating ISIS, not more than that. For the political solution and supporting such a model, we didn't see it. So why do you think this is what is the reason for that? The other thing, you mentioned about the election. We will have the election so far on 11th of June, the municipality election. So do you think that there will be a possibility to send any international observer to go and observe this election so that it will be very transparent and democratic, and which we want that? So why there is no one or any organization go and to observe this election? Thank you so much.
Regarding the question of the elections, there are, other than the U.S. government, there are many organizations that also monitor elections. For example, the Carter Center. So you could approach other organizations and ask them, simply, request that they observe the elections. Often there's a long lead time, so they need to have advance notice 6 months in advance or even longer so they can plan. And I know that, again, the timeline has shifted. And I understand the reasons for postponing the elections because of, the security environment that you're facing in Northeast Syria. But, I think perhaps allowing enough lead time, telling them, again, like 6 months in advance or 8 months in advance when you plan to have the elections, and then invite them. I can't speak for those organizations, why they would or wouldn't do this, but the question that you ask about why there hasn't been a, that's partly why I included this slide in my presentation, because I want to, again, this is not like a policy report, it's an academic book, but I wanted to give people a sense of how we could connect our existing policies on women, peace and security, civilian harm mitigation, the Syria General License to what is actually happening on the ground, so that people could make those connections with our existing policies to move beyond just the focus on the Defeat ISIS campaign, which, understandably was a priority. I think that also the role of the United States in the U.S.-led global coalition, I think, when I've spoken to some officials, the U.S. officials, they've said, well, we don't want to be the only people who are leading this, global coalition, and I think they would like some of the other members of the coalition, it's like 87 different countries or partners around the world, to also, step forward and take on more leadership roles, which, I think would also be important. I know that the Italians, for example, there's an Italian special envoy for Syria who has been quite active recently, who would like to better coordinate American and European and other policies and the policies of other Middle Eastern countries towards Syria, because there's a lot of coordination effort that needs to happen. Also, the UK Special Envoy for Syria, Anne Snow, I believe, she published an article a month or two ago, actually claiming or saying that she believes we need to reconsider the way we support Syrians, and that we shouldn't just be giving them meal boxes, but we need to actually provide long-term development aid. So perhaps, again, I can't speak for the British or the Italians, but I think, there are some other countries that are part of the global coalition that are interested in, reconsidering their policies towards Syria.
And I think we have time for 2 more questions, so we'll take them together if there's another one. You, sir, I saw your hand up, and then right after that.
Hi, I'm Axel Chorlu. I'm many things, but here I'm asking the questions as a historian mainly. So 2 very related questions. The first one is, when you historically look at projects, social projects, nation-building projects, creating something new, a vision of a new society, which certainly is involved in this one, you're looking at choosing certain aspects of history, referring to history and finding continuities in history. And that's, in my studies, that's rarely accidental or coincidental. So the example that you talked about, the alliance between the ARF, the Ararat thing, and with the Kurds and so on, how did the rank-and-file people that you surveyed become aware of it? How did they learn of it? Was this through education? Is it through an oral history? What is the method of acquiring this information? And connected to that, adversity, as in a civil war, as in any kind of event like this, can drive people together. Of course, they can create unification and so on. I'm thinking of Spanish Civil War, for example. But since I said Spanish Civil War, it can also drive them apart. At the end of it, anarchists, socialists of various kinds, the Republicans were at each other's throats. So, how do you explain that? In the case of Rojava, that was not the tack that was taken, that it was a different path.
Thank you, and thank you for that. And then your question over here, yeah.
Oh, thank you. Sirwan. Oh, what's for me, right? Okay.
Yeah, sir, the blue jacket.
Yeah. Sirwan Kajo from Voice of America. Emi, you talked briefly about the applicability of this project in other parts of Syria, and there have been, some voices. For example, within the Druze community right now, there's an ongoing protest movement in southern Syria and Sueda province. Some voices have actually come out of that protest movement, calling on similar situation for their region. And even some SDF and SDC officials have said that this model is actually applicable in other parts of Syria. But I think one of your slides also talked about how, for example, outlawing polygamy in parts of Rojava. So if you look at the Kurdish heartland, it was very easy to adopt that or to implement it. But in places like Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, it wasn't possible. Now, this is just one example. So in terms of applicability in different regions with different social and cultural dynamics, how do you think this will work out eventually? I mean, at some point. Thank you.
So I'll just restate there. So we have the historical precedent, and how did people learn about the alliance between the Armenian Kurdish alliance? What was the transmission through history for that? And then why did these ethnic tensions not result in tensions, but have resulted in closer relations? And then also the applicability of this governance model elsewhere in Syria, as people have demanded.
Yeah, thank you for all those questions. So just very briefly to Axel's question, it's primarily through oral history that these stories and histories are passed down. In the chapter in my book on education, the first quote in the chapter actually is about a Kurdish woman saying how when the Assad regime still controlled the area and they went to the schools of the Ba'athist regime, essentially they only learned Arab history, Arab culture, Arab language, as if there were only Arabs living in Syria. So these are things that were passed down through families and through, not through the Syrian school curriculum, certainly. One of the interesting things, again, that I found when I looked at the Armenians in the Northeast is, so one of the things they've done is they've established a social council. It's called the Armenian Social Council in Hasaka. And in addition to teaching the Armenian language to Muslim Armenians, they're also conducting a census where they're trying to find the true size of the Armenian population in Northeast Syria, because some, didn't openly feel that they could identify as Armenian, similar to how I think in Turkey you have this crypto-Armenians or the hidden Armenians who don't actually want to acknowledge publicly that they're Armenian, which I think is really fascinating. That's one of the things that they're trying to do there. And the question of adversity, I think I don't have a good answer for that. I think you're right. I mean, adversity can bring out the worst in people, and it can also bring out the best in people. And until now, this region has endured remarkable. It's remarkable that they've endured, I think, as long as they have. But I do think we're also at an inflection point, and I think that we need to reprioritize our, Syria as an issue. I think now that Russia, for example, is more focused on the war that they're prosecuting in Ukraine, Russia's also become more involved in Africa now, after the French have withdrawn from West Africa. If Russia has deprioritized Syria, that would mean we should reprioritize it as opposed to deprioritize it. So I do think we have some opportunities now to, refocus our efforts on what's happening in Syria. And Sirwan, with your question, I think, I haven't followed closely these protests among the Druze in southern Syria, but I do think it's quite fascinating. And I know it's been periodic, right? I mean, every few years you hear about protests among the Druze in the south, and that they have similar kind of calls for autonomy. Obviously, I wasn't able to visit that area, so I can't speak to that with much, in detail. But the question you mentioned regarding polygamy, I mean, as I'm sure you know, although in the social contract they do not allow polygamy, they are not enforcing it. So it's only being enforced, for example, for those people who want to work in the autonomous administration. They do expect that, but they're not going around breaking up polygamous marriages. That's one of the things that in the interview I did with Layla Abdullah that was published with the Wilson Center a couple of years ago, where she also mentioned that they don't go and break up polygamous marriages, but they're not, but they're advocating for, for this new sort of policy. But they, like I said, they are approaching this with a fairly large degree of flexibility, which I think is one of the reasons why, similar to the issue of the female combatants, in the Sanadid forces, they're not like forcing that to happen, right? I mean, they're just, they're more like leading by example, I guess, is what how I would describe the situation. So.
And with that, that unfortunately, very unfortunately, is all the time that we have. So let me, on behalf of the Wilson Center, thank you, Amy, Austin Holmes, for coming back again and presenting your research. Thank you, Ariel, for coming back. It's good to see our alums especially come in conversation and present the work that they do here. So thank you all for coming. I believe, Amy, you have a few copies for sale if you want to grab one today, but it's also, the paperback is on Amazon, and there is also a QR code promotion for the book. If you grab that on the way out, it's another way to acquire it. So please read more and come back.
Yeah, and thank you also to everyone who joined online. So.
And thank you to everyone who joined online.